Next, a look at efforts to combat violent extremism. This discussion with Islamic religious leaders and scholars specifically focused on how people become radicalized in prison. From the Newseum Institute's Religious Freedom Center, this is just over an hour and a half.
Good afternoon. Good afternoon. I know how it is after you've eaten a real good meal. It's nap time. I don't take a nap till 3:30, so I got a little time. I'm excited about this afternoon. I was excited about this morning, and more so about this afternoon because this is my area of concentration and focus. Prisons, criminal justice. But you know, we got scholars here. We got real scholars. Isn't that interesting? And guess what? They're Muslim. Amazing. Amazing. But I thank God for the opportunity. I thank Tam for the opportunity, just for me being here. Before I introduce the panelists, just a couple of things. What do you call them? Housekeeping notes? Housekeeping notes. You will have some Q&A cards on the table, and we ask as we move along through the panelists that you pose your question and write a sentence, not a paragraph, but a sentence on the cards. Okay? The cards will be collected, handed to me. I will then read the question or the statement and defer to the panelists. That'll work? That'll work. Okay. You know, I've been in this criminal justice business for 47 years. Spent most of my time in corrections. And my first introduction to Islam, Muslims, was a case called Fullwood versus Clemmer. I don't know how many of you all knew about that case. It was a Supreme Court decision that had to do with the former police chief, Ike Fullwood's brother, who was incarcerated at the Lawton Reformatory. And the issue was the right to practice his religion, which was Islam. The Supreme Court, as I indicated earlier, ruled in his favor, and then the ball started to roll. Well, it's been my experience that Muslims who are in prison, they have been historically been the most disciplined, motivated, and keepers of the peace. Not only that, they have always been at the forefront of prison and jail reform. Inside jails, prisons, and outside jails and prisons. And I think there has been such a lack of information, okay, about what goes on, that people have this false notion that they're at war inside the prisons. That's an untruth. Muslims were the most progressive inmates that I've ever worked with. I've always been honored and proud to work with them. You know, that population in prisons is normally traumatized, undereducated, uneducated, angry, looking for a cause. As a result of their seeking that cause, prisons become ripe territory. And I say again, ripe territory for recruiters for terrorist activities. Just think about that. And that's just now beginning to really happen. I read a report the other day that a corrections director had written. I won't call the system, but he talked about how they were having meetings, with disruptive elements in the Muslim community, all right? And he was way off base because those who were, involved were not being disruptive. They were educating the total population about what Islam was all about. They're really peace-loving people. But we've listened and read all of this unfortunate information that comes out of certain houses, all right? I won't tell you what color the house is. Need not do that because you already know. In addition, the mass media, electronic, and print. So what we hope to do today is to kind of educate you, familiarize you as to what the real deal is. What the real deal is. And from there, we're really considering taking all of this stuff on the road to show the country what's really going on with the Muslim family. I guess I'm the only non-Muslim up here, huh? And I feel so comfortable. I really do. But God is good. So, having said all of that from my notes, as Kareem did earlier, I wanted to stay on target and on time. We have Dr. Abdul Haqq Baker. Dr. Baker. That's my English friend from London. Okay. Dr. Kenneth Ingram II, who says he's not there yet with the doctoral. You got it now, honorary. Right? And then my good friend Joe Bradford from Houston, Texas. All right. And I told him, they don't dress like that in Texas, man. You put the wrong stuff on, Joe. Wear your boots. Your boots, and your hat. But on a serious note, I ask that you tune in, listen, and become educated. So having said that, Dr. Baker.
Me or Joe?
Believe I'll be started?
I'll volunteer Joe.
You volunteer Joe?
Dr. Tahir volunteering me a lot in the last one, so I'll let Joe. I'll let Joe.
Joe, majority rules.
All right. Well, first of all, I'd like to thank all of you for attending today, and to thank the organizers, to thank the TAM group for putting this together, and to thank the Newseum for hosting the event, and of course to thank my good friend here, Mr. Ridley, for what do we call it?
Beats me.
Proctoring.
Proctoring? That's an English term.
That's an English term. Yes. I hang around him too much.
Yeah. Moderator.
Moderating, yes.
You've been Americanized.
Yes. So what I wanted to talk to you today we're supposed to be talking about radicalization in the prison system, or the prison system. Is it a hotbed for radicalization or for reform? What is the role that Islam can play in preventing radicalization and reforming people that may be incarcerated or may be prone to recidivism or along those lines? What I would like to speak to you today about are three main issues. Number one is, how legitimate is the charge that radicalization is rampant in the U.S. prison system? Number two, what challenges does government involvement pose to the process of de-radicalization? And number three, how can Muslim beliefs become an effective tool for change and positive reform of prisoners and in prisons? Now, when we're discussing about the issue of prison radicalization, it's very important first to challenge the notion of its existence. And I'm asking, as a non-specialist in that area, I don't have the empirical data, but is there sufficient empirical data that is being provided by those who are making claims that radicalization is happening at a rampant rate in the U.S. prison systems? As Dr. Ridley said, yes, there is susceptibility, but is it actually happening? That's a question that we have to ask, and we cannot just answer in the affirmative based upon biases that we carry about people who are incarcerated, about Muslims, or the nature of Islam, or any other minority faith group in the United States. To further claims like this is to malign a community and is not only bad character, but it's bad policy. It also cannot go without saying that assumptions about radicalization play heavily into prevailing prejudices in the American psyche, whether those be race-based prejudices as members of an ethnicity being predisposed to criminal intent and action, or religion-based prejudice functioning the same way. Many times, these two prejudices are intertwined. Islam is seen as the reason for extremism amongst many minority groups, and minority groups are seen as sympathetic to what is labeled as extremism in the minds of majoritarian members of society. In essence, this line of thought, i.e., race-based or religion-based prejudice, attempts to pin the causes of extremism and radicalization on something outside of and foreign to the American cultural psyche, namely seen as Judeo-Christian, civilized, and of European background. The racialized tones of many of the discussions on this issue lend credence to this. However, my comments here today will not focus on the empirical data, and instead, for had that been the case, I would be speaking to you not in my role as a member of the American Muslim community, nor in my role as a thought leader in that community, but instead as a member of one demographic that data has shown is most predisposed to violent extremism and homegrown terror, namely middle-aged white American males. What I do want to talk to you today about, and what my comments will focus on, are the epistemological challenges of those who have to straddle what seem to be competing value systems. The values of freedom of religion, speech and expression, the value of reasonable accommodation for those who are incarcerated. On one side, we have these values. On the other side, we have religious affiliations and ideologies and beliefs that may be opposed or seem to be opposed at times to the systems that seek to protect it. And let me give you an example. If I, as an American, and this is not my belief, but if I were to say that I believe it is wrong for any American to have access to a firearm regardless of what type it is, I believe that all firearms should be banned. This is a belief which goes against a core constitutionally protected right. However, my adopting this belief does not forfeit my right to be protected by all of those other constitutional rights that are afforded to me. The question then becomes, is protecting beliefs and values that are not normative or not popular? If we do so, are we in some sense going against our own values in favor of another value system? Those who we see as conservative or extreme, when we protect their rights to hold those beliefs and to practice those beliefs within the confines of American law, does that mean that we are enabling illicit practices or endangering the American public? Additionally, is it appropriate for us to label those that we see as conservative, austere, or beyond our own scope of practice as something which is extreme or veers off towards the path of radicalization? When such labeling becomes a matter of policy, this is where the problem grows. So there's an obvious danger from the government exceeding its boundaries and going beyond mere religious accommodation to religious dictation, dictating to any individual or any group the belief and or beliefs and practices that are considered legitimate or a legitimate form of that faith. If viewed solely through the lens of national security, it would seem to make sense to challenge the ideas that lead to radicalization. And I think that we can agree that those do need to be challenged. But when the assumption is that radicalization is, or especially when the assumption is that radicalization effectively counters terrorism and protects the American public. So why shouldn't government officials try to marginalize what they view as theology cited by violent extremists, one that poses a danger not only to individuals, but to society at large? The problem is that when governments attempt to dictate to anyone their religious beliefs, they create a myriad of legal and strategic tensions. For the practitioner of that religion that is targeted by that government, This government-sponsored religion appears to be a faith which is foreign to their own, and one that they do not recognize. And in the context of the broader Muslim community, it appears that the government is playing favorites and rereading their religion through national security contexts, dictating to them what is and is not acceptable. This would contravene the basic rights enshrined in the Constitution that everyone, regardless of faith, expects to be afforded to them under law. And this is then exacerbated when the target populations that make up the majority of Muslim communities come from backgrounds where the expectation from government is that they intervene to the detriment of the individual. Whether it be the historical memories of programs like COINTELPRO or the security apparatuses of foreign governments persecuting even the most basic performance of faith, such as prayer in the mosque, as happens in many Muslim-majority countries, U.S. government programs that seek to dictate to Muslims what their beliefs are or should be will naturally cause mistrust and inadvertently push people away and towards radicalism, not away from it. Even indirect influence into the community's thought process can be seen as suspect, and many times is. Programs that seek to co-opt leadership in the Muslim community, such as PREVENT or CVE, for the purpose of combating radicalization, will oftentimes have the opposite effect. When the individuals that represent religious authority in the community are seen as puppets or compromised, then we cannot expect those who would lean towards radical beliefs to confide in them and to reform their ideas. We certainly can't expect them to stay away, as they will consistently try to mend the rift created from what they see as a compromised religious ideal. And by expecting a breach of confidentiality from pastors, imams, chaplains, and those who work in religious functions in Muslim communities, we compromise the effectiveness of religious authority to be a positive force in de-radicalization. The solution, in my humble opinion, lies in not just creating institutions and initiatives that are grounded in faith, socially relevant and legally viable, but in reevaluating what it means to have religious leadership. Who really is an imam? Who really is a chaplain? What authority do they have, and who speaks for Islam? What sort of faith do we have in our texts, and what sort of trust do we have in those entrusted to interpret it? If we can't answer this question as a Muslim community and instead allow ourselves to interpret it, then how are our personal interpretations or the interpretations of a government more authoritative or valid than those of others, say radicals? Here I feel it's important to mention as well that Muslim communities themselves can not only denounce radical beliefs, but they must see themselves as partners and be seen as partners by organizations and government authorities that want to work with them to combat the co-opting of their beliefs for any purpose, whether that be for national security assumptions or to promote extreme acts that will damage society as a whole, at home or abroad. So the question then is, how can Muslim beliefs be used for positive change and reform of people prone to radicalization? With regards to the national security interests, government policies, the policies of correctional institutions, what is needed is an open-door policy for religiously affiliated or qualified individuals to be able to counsel, teach, and advise incarcerated individuals that may be susceptible to radicalization. With regards to chaplains and those working in the rehabilitation of prisoners, it's absolutely imperative that a theology of personal choice and a theology of personal responsibility be inculcated in them and all those that are under their supervision. Speaking from a Muslim theological perspective, this means that the basic beliefs of Islam are taught to those individuals in a fashion that does not play into the tropes of any one radicalist or extreme group. Chaplains and other individuals, as well as lay people themselves, may subscribe to a more conservative or liberal point of view about their own faith. But we have to recognize that it is not one individual perspective of religion, whether that be Islam or any other religion, that is susceptible to being co-opted by radicals or extremists. Indeed, we've seen in the past 2 years how versions of Sunni Islam, of Shia Islam, and even of Sufi Islam in the events that occurred in Turkey have shown us that regardless of religious orientation, each of these groups may be co-opted for political purposes. One of the hallmarks of radicalist belief is their tendency to engage in groupthink, negating from the individual their personal autonomy and their ability to make their own decisions, and instead demanding from them dogmatic, rote application of the group's ideals. It's imperative for any chaplain or teacher of those susceptible to radicalization to present the general precepts of Islam and how first and foremost every individual believer be held accountable for their actions and their beliefs. In several verses of the Quran, this idea of personal responsibility is reiterated. Every soul shall be accountable for what it earns, says one verse, and in another, no soul shall bear the burden of another, and in yet another, every soul shall be concerned with itself on the day of judgment. In one prophetic tradition, a man came out of the desert and he asked the Prophet Muhammad if he only prayed his prayers and fasted his fast and gave his charity and did the basics of Islam, would he enter paradise? And the Prophet said emphatically, yes. When he left, the Prophet turned to his companions and he said to them, if he is true to his word, then he will indeed enter paradise. In another tradition, the Prophet said, the Muslim is the one who people are safe from his tongue and his hands. The believer is the one who the people are secure from. And the immigrant, or the emigrant, the muhajir, is the one who migrated away from sinfulness. In another tradition, he says, whoever kills a person whom they are in covenant with, they have a social contract with, then they will not smell the scent of paradise, even though its scent can be smelled from a distance of 70 autumns. A bit of allegory there in the words used. So tying this to what's related as points of historical memory or points of consensus in early Muslim scholarship is important as well, so that those who are susceptible to radicalization can see that the ideas of being civic or having civic duty and personal responsibility have primacy not only in Islamic texts, but have been upheld as ideals from the earliest Muslim generations. The key here is inculcating in people the ability to make informed religious choices, and that their religiously motivated practices be made consciously by themselves. Those who are susceptible to the nuances and they must be taught that the ultimate responsibility of each and every one of them falls upon themselves to ensure both their personal and public safety. Teaching the Muslim individual, whether incarcerated or not, that they have a civic duty towards their fellow man and a personal responsibility in front of God to fulfill that duty is paramount. It will only be through the teaching of Islamic beliefs in their broadest sense that will create a sense of identity in the religiously practicing individual, that they will be protected from possible radicalization. What this does is it creates in the mind of the practicing believer that their personal private practice does not and should not dictate the minimums of public religiosity. So while I as an individual may be more conservative or more austere in my approach and practice of religion, I am not expected, nor should I force that upon the public. In fact, what I'm expected to do as a religious practitioner is to guarantee for the public their personal safety from myself and from anyone who would want to do them harm. So by encouraging those susceptible to take personal responsibility for their actions and pairing those actions with being held accountable by God Himself without any help or assistance from those close to them, along with prophetic traditions that we mentioned, those working in the service and education of incarcerated individuals can be the preventative cure to any lapses in judgment and possible engagement with radicalized groups. And to sum up my long run-on sentence to you all, charges that radicalization is a problem, and specifically charges that radicalization to Islamic extremism is a problem, need to be substantiated with hard numbers so that they are not used as a tool for propaganda seeking to marginalize Muslims both in and outside of prisons. When government officials attempt to dictate religious beliefs, they create a myriad of legal and strategic tensions, effectively contravening both American values and jeopardizing and or reversing the desired effects of de-radicalization. And this pitfall can be avoided by governmental agencies partnering with, not targeting or sponsoring, Muslims with the requisite expertise necessary for positive change and reform of prisoners and those that are inclined to radicalization. Muslim chaplains, imams, experts, and community leaders can effect positive change through encouraging theologically grounded concepts of personal responsibility, civic duty, and accountability to God, rooting this in historical memory and enabling those individuals to take personal agency in their religiously motivated practices. And thank you very much. That's all I have to say.
Thank you, Joe. Thank you very much. One of the resounding themes, as we've heard from this morning, and of course we're continuing now, is education. Education. We need to focus on the politicians, government leaders, community leaders, that whole family as to what this is really all about. And now we will hear from Dr. Ingram.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. In the name of Allah, the All-Merciful, the Bestower of Mercy. The world of incarceration, it is an interesting one. We have people in our societies that commit crimes. And then when we believe that we have the right person, we then put them away in our prison system. Hopefully we got the right person. What is consistent, though, is that these peoples, this population of people, that they are stored away for years on end. And what we don't always consider at that time is that this population of people, they will become returning citizens. They will be coming back into society. So at the point that we realize that, it raises two questions. One question is, how will this person be when they come back into society? And for all these years that we stored them away, secondly, what was their developmental process throughout that period of time that they were away? So, when you think about this, if a person is successful when they come back into society, a lot of that does have to do with the support that they receive when they come back out into society. But a larger part of that has to do with how they were being cultivated while they were being incarcerated. So we return back to this point so we can discuss this a little bit further. When you look at the prison system from a theological basis and the inmate populations that are within the prison systems, you find interesting things. You learned a lot. Things you didn't know existed that people take as a faith. Things such as Odinism, Temple of the Black Messiah. Right? You learn about the Wiccan faith group and Native American heritage and spirituality. You learn things. But amongst everyone who is present, the largest population is the peoples who ascribe to the Christian faith. That's the largest population. Second to them, what is pretty consistent after that, will be Muslims. Now, in this state, we currently have about, well, upwards of 20,000 people that are incarcerated, fast approaching 30,000. Now, what's interesting with this, and I need y'all to welcome me a little bit. What's interesting with this is that the world of incarceration is not the real world. And the rules to function when one is incarcerated are not necessarily the rules that you and I are operating by. It's, in many ways, a very survivalistic atmosphere at times. And we place people in this environment, and it's also a very authoritative environment, and a lot of control is taken away from these peoples who are incarcerated. So you kind of stew all that in the pot, and you have people that become very susceptible to being anti-government, anti-establishment, anti-authority. With this, we should mention a brief story. About 10 years ago, I had a discussion with an agent of the Federal Bureau of Investigations in my home. And we had a bit of a debate in our discussion. And what he had posited, the theory that they were operating with at that time, was that a person who is incarcerated and is African American and is Muslim, and then further ascribes to what some would categorize as Salafism, equates to terrorism, homegrown terrorism. So we had that discussion, we had that debate. I believe I won that debate. But we need to say this. On the ground, real time, in the prison system, you do not commonly find people who ascribe to radicalized Islam ideologies, if we're going to utilize that term. You don't find people who they ascribe themselves to ISIS, let's say, right? Or as Dr. Baker mentioned earlier, Daesh and such. You don't find that. That's not really there in that type of a way. So it's not, the prison system is not producing terrorists in that way. Is there radicalization? Is there extremism? Yes, that exists. That is part and parcel of the nature of what the prison system breeds. Because it is a very survivalistic type of atmosphere, a very base nature type of atmosphere, there's a tendency for the peoples who are being held there to see things in terms of black and white. Sometimes you might get gray, but you won't get a broad spectrum of color in their thinking and decision-making process. Now, there's something else that we want to add to this pot that's being stewed, and it's the direction of the prison system at current. If you go back far enough, you go back into the late 1800s, throughout the 1920s and beyond that, the focus was on penalization, it's punishment, right? At a point, it wasn't even lawful for them to speak to each other. Even when they were working, they couldn't talk to each other. Move forward a little bit into the 60s, it became rehabilitative. Now, that stretched out into about the 80s or so, but with the war on drugs and things of that nature, that shifted. So it's not so much focused on rehabilitation anymore. We think it is. We do enough to make ourselves feel like maybe there's rehabilitation going on there. And there are some programs that are present, but many of the programs are either not relevant or not updated, not properly funded. Why would we put money into these people who are harming us and doing a disservice to our society? So all of that, when they come out, you may have a problem. They may not be able to integrate properly back into society. Now, along with this, to add to the point about not really finding people who ascribe to terrorist groups and things like that in prison as a norm, prisons are pretty much like a quarantine. From the perspective of the inmate who's being held, they're operating almost 20 years in the past, right? Well, we have monitors, screens, and things of this nature, right? So when they are in their circles and they're learning, not always, but it's not uncommon that they're still using chalk on boards and they're using paper. And you have people there who don't even probably know how to utilize a computer, right? Connected that to the point of Dr. Wyatt and Dr. Baker, where much of the extremism is coming by way of the internet and online. They don't have access to that. It's a quarantine. So from this perspective, it is a safe environment to a degree of foreign ideas entering into it because it's quarantined. But because of the nature of the prison system, they are very susceptible to extremist ideas and behavior. Now, we do have peoples, as Dr. Baker has mentioned, that are now being incarcerated into our systems who do ascribe to such ideologies. Now they're coming in. So you connect these people with those people, and it is very feasible that without the proper development, without the proper programs, without the proper access, they can be easily convinced that these people, these institutions, the government that has put these institutions into place that have you here for so long and your life has been taken away, see, they're the problem. They're the problem. And this is our solution for that problem. Now, this affects both peoples who are Muslim and non-Muslim in the prison system. I'll tell you why. Throughout the prison system, Islam is the second largest faith, but it's fastly growing. And many people are embracing the faith of Islam throughout the prison system nationally. So if they are influenced in this fashion and Islam continues to spread, well then these extremist ideologies may also spread along with that throughout the prison system. So what I'm saying is we have opportunity. We have opportunity now to get on the forefront of this, to get ahead of it by getting into these prison systems, reaching the inmate population, bringing them up to date and properly educating them and properly developing them concerning extremism and concerning misinterpretations of Islam, so that they can be properly equipped to understand what is going on and to deflect any doubtful matters that may be presented to them. If we do not, then as months and years come and they come back into society, then we may actually have real-time homebred terrorists. So these are the thoughts that I had to offer as a premise, at least to open a discussion real time, what's going on the ground, and just to open up our minds and get us thinking a little bit. So with that, we turn the floor back over.
Thank you. Again, I know you all have eaten. It's early afternoon. Let's stir up the pot a little bit. As we think about corrections corrections is governed by public policy. Public policy leads to revenue, money. As I heard Dr. Ingram speak, he's talking about improving conditions and corrections from a humane standpoint, a humanistic standpoint. And that's something we typically miss, along with in that continued thread of educating people as to what Islam is really all about. There is and should be an effort to educate correctional leaders because they really set policy. They need to know and understand who they're setting policy for. And they don't have a clue. Right today, there are only 3 persons of color who run adult correctional systems in America.
Really?
3. Now, what does that speak to? Now, if we control legislative, okay, folks, Congress and all of that, you see a whole different, okay, operation. But public policy drives this stuff. It drives it. City councilmen, local legislators, governors, they control this. So as Dr. Ingram was speaking, conditions are poor, and as a result of that, people are angry. They're already angry, but you put them in these horrible conditions, and they become angrier. So they become vulnerable. Whoever makes it sound good, that's where they're going to go. Okay? Now, we come to the honorable, the wonderful, the blessed Dr. Baker.
Thank you. I want to revisit some of the frameworks that we've looked at before. It's necessary to do that. I think following on from Joe and Dr. Ingram to be, their lectures, one of the important things that the agencies need to do, you've seen this particular framework again that I've used. We need to identify and understand the stages of development of the inmates as they are going into these institutions. Why? Because it's likely, and my colleagues here can confirm, that they're going to replicate at a microcosmic level the very communities they come from. We see it with the gangs. The gangs gravitate towards their colleagues within the gangs, and there are particular codes and ethics they adhere to. Similarly, I know from a British context, and more than likely from a US context, when they go into prison, they gravitate towards those of like-minded ideology, culture, and background. Those that don't, they're coming into an arena of uncertainty, be it non-Muslims who convert or Muslims who come from a generality of communities, the wider, more superfluous community we're looking at as Muslims. And so they're very, very vulnerable and very, very susceptible. Professor Basia Spalik and I wrote an article that was produced in English and released in Turkish last month, The Institutionalization of Islam. And what you've been hearing from Joe and Dr. Ingram here are concerns around that. Because if statutory institutions have a perception of Muslims coming in, they're going to make them gravitate or place them in categories that they are comfortable with. This is potentially disastrous. So understanding the inmate that's coming in, not just their dietary needs, not just the clothes that they're wearing, but understanding their religious direction, their religious underpinning. Do they come from any of these communities? Remember, these are not just the 4 communities we've mentioned before. You could produce this framework for the Sufi community, the Shia community, and the dichotomies that are existing within those. Once you've identified that, You then need to ask yourselves, is that also taking place outside and inside? There was mention of how they, when they're released, how they come out of prison. Are they still within the same community that they were in before? By virtue of their prison release, do they have to relocate? What are all the factors that are surrounding this particular individual? Have we equipped them? I know in the UK, for example, many individuals who were released from prison ended back in prison because they could not cope with what they faced outside. Yet they were told, either go back into your community and familiarise yourself, that's where the crime, that's where the extremism, that's where the radicalisation was, or they moved them to different environments and they couldn't cope or adjust there because it was an alien environment for them. This was a framework that I developed during my PhD studies, and I adapted that from an altogether different field of research, management, the life cycle of organisations, and I took that and adopted it to see if I could test that regarding converts and Muslims who were returning to Islam. And you'll see there are 4 stages there. The founding stage. The founding stage is a very new developing stage for an individual. They're very susceptible, very vulnerable at that stage because they lack knowledge. What they have is religious vigour. What they have is emotion. Their learning and their knowledge is garnered from abstract understandings. They haven't experienced what they're learning. They then move to the overzealous stage of the youthful foundation. And if you look at many of those who have gone to Syria, Iraq, the Richard Reeds, the shoe bombers, the Zacchaeus Mousawis, and you listen to their rhetorics in court, you'll see it's overzealousness. You'll see misplaced understandings of the religion, as Dr. Tahir had mentioned earlier on. And these particular areas here are highly politicised, vulnerable stages. When inmates are coming into prison, do we even know what stage they're at when they come in? Do we know these stages? If we capture them, and I don't mean literally chains capture them, I'm talking about when they come in with their mental states, with their religious states, conditions. If we are able to engage with them at this stage and provide a discernible context of learning, then we're starting in the right direction. But this is not just for the Muslim chaplains. This is for the institutions themselves. So again, we go back to what was mentioned earlier. If there is this partnership, these discussions can take place. The Muslim experts can come in and take time to establish, to determine where these Muslims are. And we want to move them, like ourselves, to these safer stages, the adult phase, the mature phase, where reflection takes place, where actualization takes place. What is actualization? They are now practicing their religion and tenets of their faith from practice, from understanding, from experience, not from abstract DVDs, YouTube, listening to a context that is altogether different because it's coming from a different part of the world, be it Asia, the Middle East or Africa. They are able to contextualize, but we need to work together institutionally to move them in that direction and not place them into categories that suit our system so we can tick the right boxes. The last figure that you saw, the last framework you saw was quite a basic rudimentary framework. There are some converts here, I understand, who can resonate, that resonates with. The more detailed one, the following here, was a further adaptation. And the reason I developed this is because you have an issue. We've talked about susceptible, vulnerable inmates. We've heard that from my 2 colleagues. What about extremist protagonists? And let's focus now. And you might say, well, why do we need to look at a framework for them? When I was studying, I did the case study of Abdul Faisal. I couldn't fit him into the previous slide. I couldn't say he was at the founding stage. It was the descriptors were too basic. I wouldn't say he was at the adult or mature phase either, because of the nature of his propaganda. That doesn't mean that extremists do not reach that, but I couldn't fit him into that category. So I was thinking, when I do sit with my professors, they're going to say to me, your PhD is incomplete, you've got to come to a conclusion. So I searched and thought, how can I solve this particular problem? I was able to amalgamate these 2 theoretical frameworks and develop what you see at the bottom there with regards to abstract understandings to actualizing. And I was then able to place individuals like Faisal at the youthful phase. Why? Because he was providing information which he had not fully embraced himself. He provided information and he was disseminating it with his own understanding and misinterpretation of the religion. He had an element of actualization, however, because he went and studied in a Muslim country. But his actualization was distorted. And I talk about the propagators as well as they enter the institutions. Why? And I will give you, we said we're going to spice it up a little bit. And I'll give you examples. An individual was in prison in the UK. And they placed him beside one of these propagators of extremism while he was in there. Just before that individual was to be released, I was abroad and I received a phone call from the police. I thought, what are they doing ringing me here? And they told me, we have got intelligence that this individual is going to be released very shortly, and he has been discussing the assassination of 2 individuals when he leaves. One is an imam, and the other is somebody else who was at the other end of the telephone call. When I got that phone call, I was surprised, and I wondered how that could have taken place. And with them knowing how they had an inability that this individual was going to be released and come into the community, with them knowing the level of the threat, they couldn't and wouldn't do anything about it. So they just didn't have the mechanism. If any help was needed, such and such had happened. Colleagues put in mechanisms of support around the imam, and when the individual came out, because some of them knew him, they engaged with him. I want to move to a different stage now to show you about what is required when engaging with extremists and their followers and their foot soldiers. And there are very few communities that show the wherewithal or bravery, I'm not saying I'm brave, but the courage to deal with this. What did we do? We let the individual come back into our community. The individual took part in my program, the street program. I deliberately engaged with this individual and spent time with him. Privately, obviously aware of what had come to me from intelligence. And this is another thing I'd say to statutory partners. Your intelligence has to be accurate. It has to be accurate. Because if we respond to what is given to us in every instance, we can perpetuate, we can exacerbate the problem. So as a Muslim community, we relied upon our own intelligence among our colleagues. Those who were still in prison, those who were out of prison, who gave some feedback, which enabled that engagement to take place. Another individual came to this individual later on, and I got him working voluntarily in my organisation. And he told him, do you know this information had come to us? And do you know that Abdul Haqq had such and such and such? The individual contacted me on the phone in tears. He said, I will never harm you. I will never harm you. Had that been the intention from the beginning, Allah knows best. But due to the engagement, remember the motto of my organisation, it's for you, from people like you. If we fit these individuals into these boxes and these categories, Muslims or non-Muslims, we give them no room for development. We stereotype them. We've seen this happening with black communities, minority communities, not just here, in the UK and elsewhere. When we put them into neat little boxes, because we can deal with those boxes, there's no room for progress for those individuals. And many of those individuals will say, well, if this is the category you're placing me in, I'll act the fool and play that part. And they'll do it very well. So understanding these stages of development is essential for institutions at an institutional level, in order to address some of the issues that I've addressed and what you've heard here from my colleagues. And I'll conclude there. There's a description of those levels that are there. And if you've got time to read them, please do take time to have a look at them, on how the most rudimentary understanding needs to progress to a level of wisdom, where individuality, where responsibility, as Joe has mentioned, is taken on by the individual. They take responsibility for their own actions. They process things from a process of knowledge if they have access to that knowledge. They process it within an environment where they're entitled or provided with the amenities, with the utensils to do that very thing. So we don't move them. We talk about groupthink, and we know that's a problem. We talk about cultism, we know that's a problem. But if we're reinforcing groupthink and cultism because we're not enabling them to act as individuals, to process things themselves, to not identify them as a category. And I'll conclude on this point, which is very, very key, which will go into the next topic. Because someone finds a sense of religiosity, many go into prison and become more practicing of whatever faith it is. The man might start growing his beard. He might start praying 5 times a day. But we start becoming worried as an intelligence or security apparatus saying this individual's moving towards extremism. Now, in my research, and it's not only me who's looked at this, we've got to differentiate between ideological extremism and behavioural extremism. Behavioural extremism is subjective. In France, the niqab is seen as extreme. In Saudi Arabia, it's not seen as extreme. In another country, the beard might be seen as extreme. In another country, it isn't. It's subjective. We cannot determine extremism based on outward appearance and particular modes of behaviour. However, if we establish there is an ideological line of extremism, I've mentioned earlier on, Sayyid Qutb divided an aspect of Tawheed, the unification of Allah's names, His worship. They divided that into a 4th category. The Muslim world has divided it into 3. They made a 4th category and politicized it. Tawheed al-Hakimiyya. When we hear individuals espousing that, because that then's talking about governments now. The governments in the Middle East need to be overthrown. Then, for them, it was the near enemy. Al-Qaeda then changed it to say we need to go to the far enemy, the West. If we hear these types of beliefs, if we hear these types of beliefs being espoused that when we come out, we can rob and steal in the name of Islam and kill non-Muslims, then you know that is ideological extremism. And aspects of the behavior are analogous to that. But behavior by itself, institutions need to be very careful when they see an increase in religiosity. And they take that as indications and symbolism of extremism. This is very dangerous. And this tends to be happening in the UK prisons. I'm not sure if it's happening in the US prisons. But we need to differentiate between those two. And I'll conclude on that point. Thank you.
Thank you. Q&A. Ooh, we got some wonderful... The only issue, Joe, is reading them.
Oh, yeah.
They write like you.
I specialize in manuscript reading.
You might have to do this. Often penal systems/jails are described as networking opportunities for people of like-minded ideology to make corrections. How true is this? And how to prevent it, if true? I say again.
Please.
Often penal systems/jails are described as networking opportunities for people of like-minded ideology to make connections. In other words, people of like mind network. I think that's what they're trying to ask. Is that correct? Thank you. Who wants it?
I'll start. I'll be so that I don't get anyone deferring to me like my brother Tahir.
I defer to you.
No, that's okay. I will talk from 2 examples. When we look at how Daesh, ISIS formed, and the prison that they were held in, Camp Buka, we are seeing emerging evidence that people of like-minded individuals came together, and that was a finishing school where ISIS emerged. We've got evidence of individuals exchanging numbers and writing the numbers and stitching them on the inside of their underwear and making sure that when they went out to their various regions of Iraq, that they would be in contact with each other. So there's evidence that points to what the gentleman's saying. In the UK, they had an issue with a gravitation of individuals towards the extremists. And no matter where they moved them to, they saw there was this gravitation towards them. Hence, most recently, they're talking about having a prison within a prison where these extremists and the extremist ideologues are going to be completely isolated. Is that the intent? Obviously, it's the institutions that determine where these prisoners and these inmates are going to be moved to. Again, it's understanding what we've been discussing here that can prevent like-minded individuals coming together of extremist nature to set up the platform that they've done. I've already mentioned the microcosm of communities from the macro element that's there. That's not necessarily wrong in itself, but if it's from an extremist element, we need to be very, very careful that we avoid that. And not only avoid that, some may say we need to put the extremists amongst the wider community. We need to make sure that he or she doesn't instill or inculcate the unsuscepting and vulnerable individuals in that instance as well. So this is an institutional thing that causes that by default. It can't be done. I can't say, Brother Ingram, I'm going to this jail. I'll see you there. I can't do that. We are not moved in that. We do not determine where we are being relocated. So institutionally, we need to have these mechanisms in place to ensure like-minded of extremist rhetoric and disposition, are not aligned beside each other.
Okay. Anyone else want to stab at it?
Sure, something like that. Yes, I would just like to add maybe 2 points. I do believe I understand the connotation of the question. All that being said, I believe that we should add a qualifier. So the connotation of the question is speaking about groupthink as though it has a negative connotation. Groupthink as an independent entity is not necessarily negative. All of us are here today because we have some similar line of thought in rectifying extremist ideologies. Is that a negative thing? No. So just to highlight that we need to qualify that. The second thing that I would say is these peoples who are engaging in this form of extremist behavior or radicalized Islam, if we want to utilize that particular argot, it is ideological in its base. So because of that, in order to solve it, not denying that there are socio-economical, political factors that may bring about these particular actions, but at its base is ideological. So if we accept that at its base it's an ideological challenge, then we need people that can approach it at its base in the ideological arena. And by default, the best people that will be qualified to do so would be Muslims who are properly trained in the faith and in the orthodoxy of the faith and in the tradition of the faith in order to approach this properly. So in answering the question, again, it should be approached ideologically from people that are qualified to engage it.
Okay.
I think the only thing that I'd add, if I may,
Sure.
is recalling what you mentioned about policy.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, it's true that, I mean, even without speaking about issues of radicalization or extremism or ideology, even for things as simple as petty theft and crime, the adage has always been that people will go to prison, go to jail to learn, and will come out knowing more than they had beforehand. And we've now talked about the symptoms about what goes on after they've gone in. One of the elephant in the room is that we're actually spending more in the United States on prisons than we are in education.
Yeah.
And we have put more into the school to prison pipeline than we have to the school to college pipeline. And until we solve that problem, we will not solve the problems of ideological crimes or behavioral crimes unless we actually invest in all forms of education, starting at very, very young ages.
Okay.
Excellent point.
Here we go. There has been backlash in Montgomery County against CVE. How is your program different? Is there a particular program you...
Yeah, we have the BRAVE program.
I mean, here, anyone up here, how is their program different? Are you focusing on one of their programs?
Yeah, the Prince George's.
Prince George's?
TAM.
Oh, the TAM program?
So just to clarify, CVE is Combating Violent
Yeah.
Extremism, and it was a
Right.
government-funded program that has that people get funding from.
Right.
I think that probably you both will be able to speak to that a little bit more about the differences between the programs. Personally, I wouldn't.
Well, me myself, before answering that question, I would definitely want to be more aware of the particulars or the nuances of CVE to do a proper cross-reference.
I don't know the project that you've done coming from the UK myself, but what I would say, one of the reasons why I'm very pleased to be part of the TAM program, the initiative, is they've incorporated the best elements and built upon them regarding de-radicalization, counter-radicalization and terrorism with the most qualified. And one of the elements that is missing from many CVE and we call them counter-radicalization programs in the UK is that ability to effectively engage head-on with the issue of radicalization and violent extremism, is the inability to identify at the right time when radicalization is taking place or the threat or the risk of radicalization, and then having the competent people on the ground operationally and then those strategically with insight to address and target that radicalization, but in a way that enables that individual to come back in inclusively to his or her environment. That's why TAM is different from any other entity that I know.
If I can just add to that, I think that when you mentioned competent individuals, what a lot of people don't know is that in the CVE community, many of the standards for identifying extremism have been simple tropes that have been repeated and reiterated. So in a CVE manual that was issued here in the United States and was copied many times over to many different areas of the country, praying prayer, the morning prayer at the mosque, was considered to be an indicator of extremist behavior, which, quite frankly, is one of the most ridiculous things that I've ever heard. Myself being in the Muslim community now for 27 some years, I have never seen those people who are so adamant about rephrasing political grievances in religious language actually being that invested in their religion. There is a Marvel comic book that is actually written by one of the writers for the Marvel comic book is a Muslim. Her name is Willow Wilson, and she's a writer for Miss Marvel, and it's about a young girl. Miss Marvel is an identity in the comic book world that passes on to people that are deemed worthy. So a young Pakistani girl living in America is deemed worthy of being Miss Marvel, and she turns into this superhero. And there's a very interesting panel in that recent, and Willow's doing absolutely phenomenal work on this comic book. There's a panel where there's an actual conversation with an individual who, overtly looks religious. He's wearing a religious garb, he has a beard, and he's being questioned. And he says, you're questioning me because I have my beard and I'm going to pray. And everyone that has been caught for doing, terrorist acts have been the guys that have been going to strip clubs and hanging out at bars and had girlfriends, right? So they're not invested. The people that are invested in extremism are people that are not involved in, they don't want to be seen in overt methods of religiosity. So that's one of the problems that I know with some of the CVE manuals and the things that are out there, is that they have focused too much on tropes instead of actually consulting with people that can focus on the ideological issues and solve those from the ground up.
Okay. What is the greatest role of an individual in prison? Reversion, conversion, radicalization, networking, mobilization, the U.S. and UK perspectives. I say again. What is the greatest role of an individual in prison? Is it reversion, conversion, radicalization, networking, mobilization, and the person would like perspectives from the U.S. and the UK?
I'm going to have to leave this to you two. I don't know it. I always joke, I say, you have converts to Islam, you have reverts to Islam, and you have loverts to Islam. They listened to Gerald Levert in the 90s and they got emotional, they became Muslim. But you guys can comment on the UK-US situation a bit more than I can.
Before we were all in America, it kind of came from Britain first, right?
Okay.
Kind of came this way, right?
The premise of the question is assuming that an individual's entering from a particular vantage point or disadvantage. So we have to look, for example, the one who's reverting or converting to Islam. The conversion rate is quite high, but I think when you look at the psychological trauma that an individual who enters a prison for the first time faces, he or she are going to have a lot of reflection about their life, and depending on that, change the direction immediately from a spiritual perspective. Research, I believe, is there that talks to that, and my colleague, Professor Bastian Spalik, in the article that we wrote, discusses that. So if it's from the premise that the individual wants to atone for what they've done, or they feel they need to make a change of direction in their life, then reversion or conversion, whichever phrase is preferred, is the road that they will take. Assuming that another scenario, that the individual then is already a Muslim, and depending on the crime that they've got being convicted of, is it within the criminal justice system and it's like bank robbery or something like this? Is it for extremist offences? It's so wide, the parameters of this question are so wide that you can't really hone it in and give a stock answer in that respect. There'd be many dynamics. Now, let's jump to the other scenario. If it's someone of the extremist protagonist ilk, their role, as we have seen, is to proselytize and to convert others to their cause. And they won't move away from that. That we have seen evidence of. So when we see that particular type of individual coming in, there needs to be a lot of checks and balances around that individual and the access they have to others, including non-Muslims. Now, that doesn't mean, well, I know here, for example, you've got Richard Rees' shoe bomber, Zacharias Moussaoui, Abu Hamza, they're in solitary confinement. I can't speak to that because, and I'm not saying whether I endorse or I don't endorse it, there are probably psychological effects and everything that needs to be taken place. And as I said, my PhD is academic, I'm not a doctor in psychology, so I can't talk to that. In the UK perspective, they seem to be following suit by wanting to build these prisons within prisons. Again, you'd need to speak to experts in that field as to the likely consequences and effects on such individuals who the noose is effectively tightened around once they enter the prison. So sorry, you've seen me talk about different scenarios because the question is quite wide and we need to be knowing the premise upon which somebody enters into these institutions.
Okay. This is for you, Joe. You mentioned that middle-aged white men are most prone to terrorism. What do you mean?
Good question. So homegrown terrorism and radicalization, and this is actually going back to the issue of CVEs. One of the problems with CVE programs is that it has been unduly focused on the Muslim community and has not focused on other homegrown terrorist groups that have carried out terror attacks on Americans of all different ideologies, sexual orientations, religions, backgrounds. And unfortunately, it is something that is, for the most part, swept under the rug. It is always assumed to be a lone wolf issue. It is always assumed to be something which is due to their upbringing. He was such a bright child. You know, we don't know where he went wrong. It's almost never attributed to their religion, their political orientation, their own radicalization online from right-wing or left-wing groups that pull them in to a false, rancid ideology. And there are several studies about this. The Triangle Group out of UNC and Duke, they have a few studies that identify white males as being susceptible to radicalization. The FBI has a few reports as well. There is the Center for Terrorism Studies at West Point that has made this point as well. And I think that it's undue, especially in the light of the fact that we are only days away from the office of an imam in Minnesota being firebombed. And we are hearing almost nothing about it, although the governor of Minnesota has come out to the shock and guffaw of the media and said this was an act of terror. We have Sikhs that were murdered in their temple. This was hardly, mentioned in line with domestic terror. It was always looked at as crime. So why do we afford we always have choice adjectives for those that we don't like, right? And if we're going to be people that believe in American values of fairness, of justice, of equity, then we should be holding everyone to the same standard. So the studies are there. You can look them up, and quite frankly, the reality is there. The question is when will when will the public vernacular change to actually address the issue? Because, quite frankly, it can be frightening, especially for the more vulnerable in society that are afraid that somebody can get on get on an airplane and use all types of curse words and call them, malign their political affiliations without knowing them and threaten them and not be thrown off the plane. Whereas someone who is African American or somebody who is visibly Muslim can be thrown off the plane simply for somebody being afraid of them. How a Latino mathematician who is doing math can be thrown off of a plane accused of terrorism for doing advanced math in a foreign language, right? So until we deal with that reality, right, we're going to deal with a lot of tension in the United States. And until we're honest with ourselves about the problems, that this is a human condition. This is not particular to a faith and or a race, but is a human condition, we'll still be, reinventing the wheel every time.
Okay, thank you. For economy of time, we got about 14 minutes left.
We cede our time to the mic.
14 minutes. Could illiteracy or low illiteracy have an effect on the vulnerability of inmates? Whoever answers kind of crypted a little bit.
Sure. And at least in opening that answer, I would offer an emphatic yes. And being undereducated or lacking education is a common motif throughout the prison system in the U.S. I don't know if it's similar in in the UK. But I mean, quite obviously, when a person is literate, then it is more likely that they will be able to educate themselves. And really, this entire discussion that we're having is about either, well, it's about miseducation, right? This entire discussion, miseducation, right?
That's right.
On different sides, right? So absolutely yes. So if they are properly educated concerning extremism, then that would have a profound effect in decreasing the likelihood of extremism in the prison system. That's my particular view. But yourselves?
May I add?
Please.
I think that we have to focus on the type of literacy as well, because very often the trope is that only those who are susceptible to radicalization and extremism are those who are poorly educated in academic or secular sciences. And in fact, that does not always hold water. Many people who have been involved in terror attacks have been highly educated. They've been engineers, they've been doctors. And I think that the problem here is not one of secular education, but one of religious literacy and religious education. There is a certain level of frustration with providence, if I may, a frustration with God's will that says, I have all of this ability, I have all these smarts, I have all of these qualifications, and I'm still unable to relieve the political grievances or the social grievances that I see in society. That frustration bubbles over because they don't understand how, as a believer, you're supposed to swim through the providence of God and navigate life, understanding that God has a purpose for all things. And so that religious illiteracy creates the frustration that brings about the radicalization. So we need not only focus on those who are poorly educated in their formative years, but those who are poorly educated in their religious beliefs as well.
Okay. This one is for me.
Welcome.
Thank you. Peter King, Republican, New York, claims that Islamic radicalism in prison poses a homeland security threat. Do you agree? Why or why not? I would answer like this. Domestic terrorism is a real problem that goes unnoticed. Okay? And there's no empirical data that says that Islamic radicalism in prison poses a homeland security threat. You ask why? One is we don't know. And I don't think so. Second, why not? Because of, if you look at Muslims who are incarcerated, as I said in my opening statement, they're the most disciplined, organized, focused religious group in our prisons and jails. And unless, as the panelists have explained, unless you get to them and steer them your direction, and we don't know that. I mean, I don't know of any instances, maybe they do, of radicalization coming out of prison. I don't. I do know that there are other groups that are domestic terrorists who come out of prison. Okay? The Aryan Brotherhood, and I can just go on and on and on. Now, that's a different picture. That's very rarely, if ever, on the news. Media, electronic, media printed, are coming from the hill over there. Okay? And that's where the real problem is. It's not Islam. It's these other groups. Who do you think planted the bomb in Minnesota?
I don't know. I haven't seen the latest
I
report.
know.
I'm sure.
I know.
I don't want to speak.
I'll speak
without
it.
fact. Please do.
I'll speak it. Yeah, it's one of them. If anyone is knowledgeable or aware, can you address the story of Iman Jamil Amin, a.k.a. the former H. Rep. Brown, with respect to the subject of this panel? Now, there's a caveat here. If anyone is knowledgeable.
I am not, although I'm familiar with who he is.
I'm definitely familiar, not as deeply as knowledgeable about what I believe the intent of the question to be.
Right.
To provide a proper answer.
Okay. Doctor?
Well, being from the UK, it's almost mythical, so I don't think I can comment on that at this point.
I knew you were going to go there. Oh, this is a deep one. Whew. How does the Justice Department respond to or addresses complaints of entrapment of Muslims in terror? I'm not sure.
Plots.
Plots? Ooh.
And what?
And what progress has the Muslim community done to address this issue? How does the Justice Department respond to or Joe?
To or rather addresses complaints of entrapment.
Is that what that is?
Yes.
Or rather addresses complaints of entrapment of Muslims in terror plots. And what progress has the Muslim community done to address this issue?
I cannot speak for the Justice Department. I don't know how their response has been, but I know that in the Muslim community there has been a focus amongst orators and people that are giving sermons in mosques and imams and chaplains that have said that have focused on Muslim youth and telling them that you should be mature enough and knowledgeable enough of your own faith to not become a tool for anyone, whether that be a radical extremist or that be someone trying to entrap you to then pin you as a radical extremist. We cannot, be foolish enough to fall into a trap or to be pushed into one. And so I know that that's actually actively happening in American mosques and amongst American Muslim youth groups, that leaders are saying you need to avoid radical extremist ideology and also do not allow yourself to become manipulated by those who have numbers that they're trying to rack up for arrests and other things.
Okay. This one. What effort is in place between the Muslim community and law enforcement to implement an intervention program where there is affirmed intelligence from law enforcement that an individual is attempting a terrorist activity directly or in a supportive role? I say again, what effort is in place between the Muslim community and law enforcement to implement an intervention program when there is affirmed intelligence from law enforcement that an individual is attempting a terrorist activity directly or in a supportive role? They really want to know, okay, what efforts?
I can speak to Texas and to Florida. Those are two states that I have lived in, I have family in, and I'm familiar with the communities there. And I know that for the Joint Terrorism Task Force, for the FBI offices and officers that are in the areas, as well as local police departments, there has been a lot of cooperation between leaders of the Muslim communities and law enforcement, that when there is actionable intelligence We're not talking about, someone, calling the FBI and their friend because they're beating them at World of Warcraft or some online game, right? We're talking about, I'm afraid for my son. He's talking about traveling overseas. You need to do something. The FBI has called leaders of the Muslim communities in Texas and several different communities and said, can you go with us and intercept this kid? Can you go and talk to him? And they have been successful in many instances of turning those youth away, and in focusing on character traits that may be triggers in the Muslim community. And so I can say that has happened in those two places for the better of that young person, to get them help, for the betterment of the community as a whole, and for the betterment of society, for saving them from any trouble that may be caused from something like that.
Okay. I got, as I read, somebody else?
Well, I was going to offer just two brief thoughts.
Please.
Both of them pertaining to Washington, D.C. Firstly, it brings to mind our brother, Muslim. May Allah heal him and grant him strength. As we heard earlier, he's undergoing some troubles with cancer and such. Yeah. But it brings him to mind. And he has established a pretty good relationship with the Washington, D.C. Police Department. And they have very fluid communication between them, and they've worked together. I would definitely be able to say, going back at least to 2010, but more likely prior to that. And I say that because I had a 5-year tenure as an imam in Washington, D.C. area. And they would actually engage the different mosques and establish communication. And during my tenure, we would go out, even support. They have what they call DC Night Out, right? DC National Night Out and things of this nature. And we would engage one another. He does very, very well with that. And he has those discussions and things that are relative. He does convey on a personal note. Also during my tenure, there was an individual of interest at the time with the FBI, and they made sure to stop by and give me a conversation, and we engaged one another, and that particular problem, I believe we were able to solve it. So there is a level of engagement within Muslim communities and law enforcement.
Okay, I got 1 minute to wrap this up, and I'll do it like this. The panel today has talked about education, education, education. How do we do that? We become ambassadors, spreading the word about true Islam throughout the faith-based community, throughout social organizations, throughout the business community, everywhere. Talking to Lottie-Dottie and everybody, okay? It's crucial that we communicate, we get the message out. The second is public policy. We have to put people in office, okay, who will carry our water. And if they don't, they got to go home. It's just that simple. Then we ask the question, and I know I'll get in trouble for saying this, who are the real terrorists? Okay? And I leave you with that. Thank y'all very much. Thank you, my brothers.
Thank
Thank
you.
you. And thank you all.
Thank you all as well.
Thank you all, most of all. Okay.
The next program will begin in 5 minutes.
Maureen, you know what's your name? It's important that you make it down.